God knows what would convince me that he exists, or God knows what would convince me that Christianity is true. Like, as I'm on this deconstruction journey, I'm starting to doubt my belief in the resurrection. I'm starting to doubt my belief in the authority of the Bible. I'm starting to doubt my belief in God's existence altogether. But he hasn't given me or shown up in a way that would convince me. So either God doesn't want to be in a relationship with me, he's fine with me being on this deconstruction journey, he's fine with me doubting, or he doesn't know what would convince me. How would you respond to that kind of criticism?
Well, I think that God has provided what ought to be rationally sufficient reasons for believing that he exists. I believe that when you look at the world around us, when we look at the created order, we are struck by the evidence all around us of design in the world, and that evidence is immediately apparent. It's pressed against our noses every time we walk outside, and there's a rigorous and explicit way of expressing and articulating the argument from natural theology for the existence of God. And you can make I've done in my own works rigorous arguments that there's a mind behind the existence of biological systems, and the fine tuning of the laws and constants of physics and so forth. But you don't have to even rest on the discoveries of modern science in order to have rational confidence that yes, there's a God who made the world, who rationally ordered it. Sometimes an objection that will come up is, why does God make it so difficult
Yeah.
to uncover his existence? And why doesn't it make it so obvious, or put the cookies on the bottom shelf, as it were?
Yeah.
Why do we need to go and acquire PhDs in astrophysics and molecular biology to discover that God exists? But I actually think it's a lot easier than people realize. That it's not that it's complicated per se, it's that it's been made artificially complicated by bad scholarship, which insists that the simplest explanation can actually be the actual explanation. And I mean, Richard Dawkins says that Charles Darwin made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. In other words, before the dawn of Darwinism in 1859, people it was apparent from the natural world that yes, these living systems that we observe all around us bear the hallmarks, the unmistakable hallmarks of intelligent causality.
Right.
And therefore, it's that evidence is really literally pressed up against our noses. When you, even before the scientific revolution, you just look at things like metamorphosis or embryology, going from a fertilized egg to an adult form capable of reproduction and so forth. These are systems which we recognize as requiring foresight to bring about. And so if there's so much evidence all around us of design in the natural world, then that should compel us at least to take the next step and investigate, well, could there be truth to the Christian religion? And we can discover that, I think, by looking at the biblical text. And I think that God has provided sufficient reason that anyone who takes the time to make oneself fully informed will, in the long run, if one is attempting to be as objective as possible with the evidence, will in the long run come to find Christianity to be true and well supported.
Well, yeah.
So,
Yeah, yeah. No, well, I was going to say, you've drawn an analogy in your article between God's existence and gravity, and people might often say, "Well, why can't God make his existence as apparent as gravity?" So I want you to flush that out for us just a little bit.
sure. So sometimes people will say, well, why can't God's existence be as apparent, immediately obvious as gravity? Well, gravity is not obvious. It wasn't discovered until Isaac Newton came along and uncovered it. In fact, in the ancient Greeks thought that everything gravitated towards the center of the earth. So gravity is not something which is immediately obvious. And by the way, just because something's not obvious doesn't mean it's not well evidentially supported. For example, one analogy I gave in my article is that of a chair, a physical object.
Yeah, this is interesting.
And the physical object, like a chair, is composed of mostly empty space because of the structure of the atom. But that's not something that's obvious. In fact, it seems to be obviously not the case that the chair is mostly empty space. But nonetheless, we know from scientific data that it is mostly empty space. And so just because something's not immediately obvious doesn't mean that it's not is not true. And furthermore, coming back to your question about God knowing how much it would take to convince me, so therefore why has he not given sufficient evidence? Well, when we go to the biblical text, we actually see plenty of examples where God gave overwhelming evidence right in people's faces, and they still didn't believe. So, for instance, you've got the Israelites in the wilderness who've seen so many miracles. They've passed through the Red Sea. God's given them the manna and so forth, so many miracles, and yet they rebelled against God. We see in the New Testament, Lazarus is raised from the dead by Jesus. And what do the Jewish authorities want to do? They want to put Lazarus to death again, and they also want to kill Jesus.
Right.
We see another example in John 20, even with Thomas. Thomas, and this is a common text that's cited, or I think misused by fideists to support fideism. So Thomas is asked. Thomas asks to see the print of the nails in Jesus' hands and feet, and the spear, the wound that from his side from the spear. And unless he see these things, he says he will not believe. And Jesus, of course, famously tells him in verse 29, blessed are you because you have seen and believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed. But what's going on there, I think, is that Jesus is chiding Thomas for having rejected the sufficient evidence. The sufficient evidence was the testimony of the other apostles. But no, he wasn't content with evidence that was rationally sufficient, that ought to provide a rational basis for believing that Jesus had indeed risen from the dead, namely the testimony of his friends who claimed that they'd witnessed him in that very multi-sensory way. But he wanted more than that. And I think if God has provided us with rationally sufficient justification for believing the gospel to be true, then it's very difficult, I think, to impugn God's goodness for not having given us even more evidence. Because the problem of divine hiddenness, I think, is often an excuse to not have to deal with the evidence. Because when you present the evidence and they say, well, why couldn't God have just given us more evidence? I mean, how much evidence would be sufficient? I mean, it seems to me that if the more evidence we have, the less surprising it is that God hasn't given us more evidence. So where do we draw the line there? How much evidence is sufficient? In fact, if you look at people like Richard Dawkins or Peter Boghossian, when they are asked how much evidence would it take to convince you that Christianity is true, they will say things like, not even the second coming would convince me.
Yeah.
In fact, Peter Atkins, whom I debated last January, year past in January, I asked him what could convince him that God exists, and he said nothing could convince him.
Right.
So, and one other point I'll make here is that, yes, God knows how much evidence it would take to convince me, but he also knows he knows how we're going to respond given more evidence, right? And if God, I think it's plausible that God could decide to withhold from us more evidence because that would make us more morally culpable, and therefore that would put us in danger of greater judgment because God knows exactly how we're going to respond. So it's not necessarily clear that God necessarily morally ought to give us more evidence, given that he knows how we'll respond to it and knows what the consequences of that would be, that we bring upon ourselves a greater damnation.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that clip of the conversation that I had with Dr. Jonathan McLatchie. If you want to watch the entire conversation I had with Dr. McLatchie, you can go ahead and click here. As always, if you are dealing with deconstruction, I would invite you to subscribe. Thanks. We'll see you next time on Dealing with Deconstruction.